When the film The Exorcist was released in 1973, the devil had been dormant for some while. He'd been reduced to a figure of fun, comic relief in kids' cartoons. What writer William Peter Blatty and director William Friedkin understood so well is that the dark gods still exist, expressions of our deepest fears and desires.
Sleet and icy rain, New Yorkers are standing in 4-hour lines at the Cinema One Theater on 2nd Avenue.
The Exorcist, which has finally made its $10 million way to your local movie theater, is a disgusting, dazzling, horrible, gasp-inducing super thriller. A movie that will, for many, clearly have gone too far by the time it is only about half over.
I remember at the box office they were passing out air sickness bags.
The word that the best thing to use if people got ill on your carpet was kitty litter.
Women 2 rows behind me literally fainted. She screamed and fainted. They must have been prepared for this because people came rushing in from the back of the theater, picked this woman up, and took her right out.
Friedkin is maliciously accomplished at setting us up for shocks and then mowing us down with them.
I was a part of the film, but I have never met anyone who was in the film. I met Bill Friedkin, that's it. I was a stranger, wandering alone through The Exorcist.
Can I help you?
1 for The Exorcist, please.
My agents called and said that there was a Hollywood director who wanted to call me.
Enjoy the movie.
I said, what do they want with me? And he said, well, Mr. Friedkin believes, and these were his words, that you're the only person on the face of the earth who could do justice to the part of the demon. Ho, 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 double-edged sword. I don't want to play any devil. I'm an Irish Catholic. On the other hand, if I'm the only one in the world who can do it.
Mother, please! What's happening? Stop! It's burning! It's burning!
Do something, Doctor, please help her!
Oh, please, Mother! We'll make it stop! He's gonna kill me! Mother! Mom! Make it...
All right, let's see what to do. Keep away! This hour's mine.
Somebody told me that there was a magazine that's a horror magazine, and they ran a contest for the 40 scariest movies of all time. And the results of the contest were that the first 39 places were The Exorcist.
It's what we would call today a docudrama. So a great deal of it is based on whatever we could discover about the original case.
The novel that Bill Blatty wrote is based on a true case of demonic possession, or a possible case. There are more things in heaven and earth than we can understand or appreciate or explain. And I still feel that's true of The Exorcist.
I just never anticipated the dementia that grew up around the experience of reading the book or seeing the film. And the closest I've been able to come to explaining it is that there is a deep-seated belief in the core of many people that a malevolent and intelligent force of evil personified does exist.
It was a true possession, by which I mean very specifically that Satan had taken over the body of that child and controlled her movements and her voice.
It just really, really affects me, the voice, because the voice is what bothered me the most about the whole movie.
They had trouble keeping ushers working on the floor. Some couldn't take it because of the noise, the sound. You go home, you hear this voice, every day you come to work. This voice, you know.
I think I heard that voice a few times in my imagination and, you know, kind of freaked afterwards.
The sound that came out of Reagan was horrifying. It was just horrifying.
My duty was to fall in love with and/or understand and have compassion for the fallen Prince of Heaven. I had a feeling that if I could become an entity, not a voice. That drives me crazy when people say you were the voice in The Exorcist. No. I tried very hard to create a character, a demon, Lucifer.
She said, I haven't had a drink for 25 years, but if you let me drink some whiskey, it will affect, and she said, and I haven't smoked cigarettes. I've been off cigarettes for 10 years. But if I start smoking, you will find weird things happening with my voice. And she said, and let me take some raw eggs, put some raw eggs down my throat with whiskey and cigarettes. Let me have my priest there, and let's see what happens.
Well, then let's introduce ourselves. I'm Damien Karras.
And I'm the devil. Now kindly undo these straps.
If you're the devil, why not make the straps disappear?
That's much too vulgar a display of power, Karras.
Where's Reagan?
In here with us.
She said, why don't you tie me to the chair? And why don't you put me through some kind of physical torture as well? Which we did.
They tore a sheet up, and they restrained me, my hands, my knees, my feet, my neck. Look what happens to your voice. It has to happen when you have no freedom. The only way I can do it now is by clutching my hands behind me.
I did a number of things, in addition to the demon voice, to just grab the audience's attention at certain places. They had conducted an exorcism in Rome, in the Vatican, and they made a very crude recording. All of a sudden, across this tape would come these blood-curdling screams of agony that was coming out of something that did not sound human. And I mixed that into the soundtrack as well.
There were certain key sounds that subliminally, I think, when they occurred, you'd know something else was going to be happening, or that you were supposed to feel a certain thing, I think. All these sounds were augmented and layered and, you know, stacked with combinations of sound. As I say, nothing was literal. I mean, you know, if you just have a bed shaking and you mic it, I mean, it's just not enough. They're breaking windows from the prop shop, you know, I mean, just going around the lot here at Warner Brothers and just, yeah, I'll take that one and the one that was used in Gone with the Wind, and, you know, all these, you know, and with us, what are you going to do with those? Well, we're going to break them. They sent me a tape recorder, and I just went out every screwy place I could think of. I went to the slaughterhouse where they were killing pigs. These pigs knew they were going to get it, so the fear of that was really, you know, because pigs are intelligent animals, and they're actually smarter than dogs. So I got a lot of that stuff.
Very often, whereas the soundtrack was, for the most part, or for a great deal of the film, was loud and clangy and disturbing, I would also take it down to a whisper. And then very often I would go to absolutely dead silence, the contrast of which provoked and kind of enhanced the idea of light and dark, good and evil.
I cast you out, unclean spirit! Shove it up your ass! In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ! It is He who commands you! He who flung you from the heights of heaven to the depths of hell! Fuck him! Be gone! Fuck him, Garrus! From this creature of God! Be gone! In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit! By this sign of the Holy Cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with the Father and the Holy Spirit. Damien!
Amen. So many people would say, oh, how could you possibly talk like that? I mean, some of that language that you used in that film, that was... Well, come on, lady. That was the devil, not Billy Graham. He talked like the devil would talk.
After the release of the film, I remember that Billy Graham, in a sermon, stated that there was a power in the film itself. I mean, he meant in the film itself, which could not be quantified, could not be identified, but there was an X factor in that film which was evil and dangerous.
I think it's the scariest movie because it is not so far-fetched. It does seem within the realm of possibility. It is like something rising up from the dark sea inside, and it's very old fear.
Here you had this naive, good little child that is taken over by the devil. Here you have in the audience this 17, 18, 19, whatever I was at the time, year old kid from Brooklyn, New York, who is not all good, who has done some pretty bad things in his life, or not. And if this can happen to her, then it can certainly happen to me.
The people who said they had to go into therapy and they had to go to their confessor, or they had to run and hide, or take medication, or vomit explosively, I think they brought those neuroses into the theater with them. They didn't pick them up from the screen. The special effects wouldn't do that. I was the sound of a human being. I couldn't do that unless the receptivity was there and ready to identify.
I have no doubt that The Exorcist moved people very, very profoundly. There's always an attempt to try and label and diffuse the impact of something that moves us deeply. I mean, very few people want to really accept the stuff that's going on there and accept it as a kind of, unknowable phenomena. It's easier to call it a horror film.
The second time I saw the film was in Rome with all of these bishops and a cardinal or two. They were enraptured by it, and they would be very critical of anything they didn't believe in.
The Pope did make a statement within a year following the release of The Exorcist, might have been shortly thereafter, reaffirming the Church's position on the existence of Satan, a supreme and intelligent force of evil, a person at large in the universe. I'm sure that had something to do with The Exorcist.
It's one of the influences in my life that teaches me the broad canvas that every human being is. I am as demonic as Satan ever was. If it's in me, it's in you, and it's in everybody. Everybody. No one is without it. It's alarming sometimes to think of that. I believe I can live with the devil in me. I'm not sure I can live with the people who want to control the devil in me.
Horror has always delighted in its maverick status. The term low budget might have been invented for the horror movie. And the same fevered imaginations that dream up these celluloid fantasies can be equally creative in getting them seen.
Suddenly, to my surprise, he did the monster mash.
The period of the 50s and 60s, it's a golden age for me because I think of how old I was. I mean, I was a kid in the 50s and a teenager in the 60s.
What's this all about? What's everybody running from? It's the end of everything. What do you mean?
I think of Roger Corman and William Castle and a guy named Ray Dennis Steckler, who also used to do very low-budget, interactive kind of gimmick movies.
I put a spell on you.
When I first started out, I was trying to figure out some sort of gimmick to get the movie in the theater. So I came up with, let's make it the longest title in the world, The Incredibly Strange Creatures Who Stopped Living and Became Mixed Up Zombies.
A title to a movie is everything. Without the title, don't make the movie.
Classic titles. I mean, I Was a Teenage Whatever, Frankenstein, Werewolf, How to Make a Monster.
That was very important with a horror movie, if you want to get to teenagers, is to use a teenage theme. In the 50s, when television came out, most people weren't aware that television was keeping people home. So what they had to do at that point was figure out how to get these young people away from that tube.
And then Attack of the 50-Foot Woman.
Well, you know, you can't really get much more absurd than Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, which is a nearly perfect film.
50-foot woman, incredibly huge, with incredible desires for love and vengeance.
It's a movie which apparently was conceived as a normal picture without any idea that the woman would be 50 foot tall. And then at the end, somebody said, wait, we'll have her be 50 feet tall. And they didn't bother to change any of the other stuff in the movie.
In the canyons of your mind.
There was a time that if you didn't play a trailer, you wouldn't book the film. You wouldn't play it.
Now, of course, in that trailer, which in those days was like about 90 seconds tops, is all you're going to get, you had to put a lot in.
I'm in love with you again.
The most blood-chilling motion picture you've ever seen.
Cat food made from human ingredients for cats who like people. It's that simple.
I used to actually make trailers for Roger Corman, and even then I think the art of trailer making had pretty much died. The wipes and the lettering and the hyperbole and the promises and the swearing that you've never seen anything as good as this.
Many times people would say the trailer is 10 times better than the movie.
Subliminal perception. How does it work? Here is a scene as audiences will see it. And here is the same scene as your brain will see it and feel it. Only 2% can detect subliminal images. Can you?
We went to the lengths of actually falsifying the plots and doing all kinds of tricks that really weren't very kosher, but would allow the picture to be successful for the 3 or 4 days that it was booked.
In the backwoods of the Everglades, the boys had only the storekeeper's woman to talk about. Then, out of the swamp's depths,
Beware of the blob, it creeps.
There are many great, wonderful horror films made in the 50s and 60s. The vast majority, though, are Drek. And there's a great enjoyment in that, too.
There were 2 different styles of monster. One was the bargain basement style.
You would have fairly intelligently written horror films until you saw the monster. And then the monster was so stupid looking.
It looks like a purple people eater to me.
And then there would be recycled monsters.
People said, Cash Flag, he's that guy with those weird eyes, and he's that guy with the hood, or whatever. So all of a sudden, people started knowing Cash Flag, because I did a half a dozen movies, and they started thinking, okay, Cash Flag means this type of film.
One of the things that's so fun about a lot of them is the lack of pretension. I mean, what is the difference between Alien and It, Terror from Outer Space? There is no difference. There is no difference.
A new dimension in shock, like spending a night in the grave. 3 of the most macabre experiences ever put on film.
Well, no matter what movie you make, if you don't promote it and you don't tell the world about it, nobody's going to see it, and you're not going to sell it.
I think hucksterism was part and parcel of the way these pictures were sold. If you just look at a press book from a picture from the 50s, a popular movie, many, many, many pages, many, many different designs, many, many different ad lines, many different approaches depending on who the exhibitor thought that their audience were.
In some of the theaters, the theater managers actually constructed a makeshift corpse grinding machine, and that caused a lot of attention.
Due to the highly intense and sinister nature of this program, the producers insist that every person in attendance personally sign a certificate of assurance before being admitted into the theater, certifying each patron of sound mind and body.
Now, promoting the Worm Eaters was one of the more real fun type things we've ever done. We had to steal the show. We had no budget to do it with. So I told Herb Robbins if he would eat a worm for the press, I would eat a worm for the press. And we got news coverage you couldn't buy at any price.
Worm eater.
Showmanship, eat worms.
Round, round, get around, I get around, yeah, get around, round, round, I get around.
Gimmicks, I love the gimmicks.
I think it was Castle who did a great gimmick, which is he was the first one to take out an insurance policy with Lloyd's of London for $1 million if you died of fright.
Even Lloyd's of London will not grant coverage for any person with a known heart condition or for suicide by any member of the audience.
By the way, I thought he was one of the greatest. You know, The House on the Haunted Hill, great stuff, you know.
It was one of the William Castle pictures where they had a thing called Emergo, and Emergo was the tackiest thing. It was a paper skeleton on a string that would come out over the audience.
There were apparently very few theaters in which this skeleton survived because kids would come back with slingshots and popcorn boxes, and it was a pretty expensive gimmick.
This mask is a mask of me, actually, when I was Cash Flag. And we sent people out looking like me. When they ran down in the audience, you would see this illuminated figure coming at you.
What's wonderful is when it's so silly.
At a drive-in theater in Las Vegas, a guy came running up with my mask on, my hood, looked in my window, and I put my hood and looked back at him. I thought he was gonna die, absolutely die. He ran screaming.
A scream will sometimes suffice.
Do you know The Tingler? That's a William Castle film where the gimmick was that fear is an actual tangible beast. And in fact, will kill you unless you scream. So you go, ah! And there's a wonderful moment when Vincent Price comes on the camera and he says, "The Tingler is loose in this theater. For God's sake, scream! Scream for your lives!"
He wired the every other seat with war surplus buzzers and turned them on at various points of the movie.
So like every fifth seat, you got a zap, and people go, ah! Jump. My favorite, though, was Mr. Sardonicus. Mr. Sardonicus was the first interactive motion picture where, as you came into theater, you were given
these little cards, or more often not, because they didn't have any. And Castle would come out on the screen, and he
says,
"At a certain point in the picture, you will vote thumbs up or thumbs down."
And we were morons, you know, we're like all going, thumbs down, thumbs down. And sure enough, he died.
And of course, there was no two endings.
This was old Cash Flag, and he'd have his old knife, and next thing you know, people were shooting me with pellet guns right in the theater, you know, and I had to duck for my life. But it was fun. But after the pellet gun started hitting me a little bit, I said, it's time to retire. Today, with the home video market, everybody who makes a film has a market. When I was making these movies, the only market we had was the theaters. If I would have had a home video market back in the 60s, oh, geez, I'd have made another 150 movies, because I would have gotten the money back earlier.
To the late night double feature picture show.
One of the most unendurable experiences we can have goes like this. We look into a human face and see madness there. Insanity is the most pure, the most undiluted horror of all. Look very closely at the faces you're about to see. Aren't they strangely familiar? Couldn't they almost be you? look closely at these faces. For me, they are the most potent expressions of the horrors of madness. Extraordinary works with an extraordinary story behind them. At the end of the 18th century, the sculptor Franz Xaver Messerschmitt produced Baroque figures like these for the Austrian court. Then, at the age of 35, he was afflicted with what at the time was called a psychic illness. He suffered from dementia, paranoia, hallucinations. Forced to withdraw from public life, he spent the rest of his days working on this series of 48 busts, mementos of his encounters with the spirits that tormented him. His friend, Frederick Nicolai, paid visits to his remote studio and recorded his impressions of this tortured man.
Messerschmitt was equally remarkable as an artist and as a man. In his art, an extraordinary genius. In the common life, inclined a little to peculiarity.
Spirits of fright torment me, especially at night.
For a long time, he couldn't understand why.
But eventually I realized that the spirit of proportion envies me for coming so near to perfection in my work. So, the spirit causes me physical pain.
To ward off these demons, he devised a system of pinches, carefully combined with certain facial contortions.
Oh!
So, he pulled faces in front of his mirror and deemed himself witness to the most amazing effects of his power over the spirits.
I decided to fix these grimacing proportions permanently. An army of magical heads to protect me from the spirits.
Now, there stood in the corner of his room a rather different head, whose form is utterly curious and misproportioned. The face is drawn almost into the shape of a beak.
The demon pinched me that time, and these figures are the results. I tell you, it nearly did for me. Luckily, it let off a sudden hellish fart and disappeared in the midst of a dreadful stench. It would surely have been the death of me.
The American writer Shirley Jackson is perhaps best known for her novel The Haunting of Hill House, an elegantly written exploration of the place where aberrant minds and supernatural phenomena meet. She's described now as the pioneer of what's been termed modern Gothic, but that barely evokes the power of her imaginative vision.
My mother was a great student of the supernatural. On the back of a book, it would say that she writes with a broomstick rather than a pen.
My mother did, in fact, say she was a witch, that she used her witchly powers, and it was on the page.
My mother turned everything into a story, and everything could become funny or frightening as she chose.
My mother believed in the power of inanimate objects to pack a wallop, as she used to say. When she gave me her typewriter, she said there are many more stories left in that typewriter.
The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank around 10 o'clock. In some towns there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, where there were only about 300 people, the whole lottery took less than 2 hours.
Come all ye fair and tender maids that flourish in your prime.
One of the earliest memories I have of my mother was her in the kitchen, the warmth, the light, the feeling of family and security. I realized that there was more going on than that she was just a mother from one day realizing that the typewriter's going all the time, that meant something. I thought it was just background noise when I was an infant.
At those times, we didn't even talk to her. She wasn't our mother then. She was the typing person, and she wouldn't be kind to us or hear what we wanted. She was working. I never will marry.
We would always inevitably go up to her room, shut the door, and we could just hear her up there. And she'd type for an hour or 2 or 3 or half an hour, whatever time she had, while at the same time running a household and keeping up with 4 very active children.
My husband, he will expect me to.
The house was filled with music all the time. My mother played the piano, my sisters and mother sang. My parents had a music box that actually had belonged to my great-great-grandmother, and it was one of my mother's prized possessions. However, it was clear early on that the music box was haunted. It would turn itself on, it would, in the middle of the night, start playing itself over and over and over when no one had wound it. I think my mother really did believe in supernatural things. If something happened, it was because magic was behind it.
My mother saw strong personalities in cats and in cars. I certainly remember her driving and urging her car to do certain tricks, and then almost always it would.
In the kitchen was a drawer, and Shirley would open it up and she'd need something, and it wouldn't be there, and she'd slam the door and say its name and open it up and it'd be on top. I've seen her do it. I can't do it myself, but I've tried.
What does it take to convince you that the dead do not always rest in peace? That some houses, like Hill House, are born bad?
When she decided to write a book like Hill House, what she did was take books out of the library on houses of New England, houses where murders had occurred.
She and I used to drive around the countryside looking for buildings that she could use. She didn't look at buildings so much from an architectural point of view, but from a personality point of view.
The first was young Miss Groton. She tried not to let him in. He stabbed her with a corn knife. That's how his crimes begin. She believed that houses also had personalities. She spoke often and strongly of the wills of inanimate objects and hoped to affect them with her will, I believe.
What she was trying to achieve was the feeling of a house substantial enough to be an entity on its own, so that it had enough substance so that you could seriously believe that it might also have a will.
Shirley could have created a house of enormous menace, horrifying implications, without ever having left her study. But she liked to work it up, get a good lather.
He crept up close behind him and strangled him with a wire.
Welcome to Cat TV Studios in Bennington, and today we're paying tribute to the great North Bennington writer, Shirley Jackson.
I like to remember those wonderful parties, and I remember one night we were playing Monopoly, and all of a sudden she sold off all her property and went into the study and wrote a story. Came back with it and read it to us and asked for criticism, and she listened carefully, and she went back into the study, rewrote it, put it in an envelope, and it was all ready to send off.
Well, I was at one party, and she had just finished a story, so she handed it to someone who was at the party, and this person went into the room and closed the door and read the story. And to this day, I will see that person come out. She just came out like this.
She takes something that's perfectly normal and she begins to see one little thing that is just slightly askew, and she builds it with another thing that's slightly askew, and by the time the story is finished, you're sitting there in absolute horror. She had tremendous insight into human nature. She felt it, she saw it, and she wrote it with her wonderful craft.
She was masterful at taking commonplace events and turning them into spine-chilling horror stories by letting the reader become comfortable enough so that the reader lets down his guard.
Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said, "Adams." A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward. They grinned at one another humorlessly and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded paper.
When the lottery was first published in the New Yorker in 1948, it created an enormous controversy, and the mail just poured in, and more letters than any story had ever received, and indeed no story since has received as much correspondence.
"Hutchinson, get up there, Bill," Mrs. Hutchinson said, and the people near her laughed. "Jones."
She wrote in 2 hours this story that will probably never die when she was pregnant with me.
Used to be a saying, lottery in June, corn heavy soon.
I used to have to collect the mail, and they would send the mail to the lottery lady, North Bennington, Vermont. You know, she was the lottery lady. Sometimes letters came in that made my mother cry about the lottery and how it was some evil story.
"Tessie," Mr. Summers said.
There was a huge flurry of negative, very venomous letters. You can't wade through that much venom without having a little of it stick to you. And Shirley must, I think, probably have been unavoidably hurt by some of them.
"It's Tessie," Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed. "Show us her paper, Bill." Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had a black spot on it. The black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with the heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. "All right, folks," Mr. Summers said. "Let's finish quickly."
My mother read the lottery to me at the kitchen table. I must have been around 7 or 8. I remember hearing it, then feeling that I had to go and hug her, and also not wanting to.
The story was written 2 or 3 years after the end of World War II, and we had the Holocaust and we had the atomic bomb. I think the point of the lottery is to make people realize that anyone and everyone can convert to mob behavior, and that's where the horror sets in.
The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles.
Here, Davy.
Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair, it isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screamed. And then they were upon her.
Oh, it isn't fair! It isn't right!
The lottery, in a sense, is just a statement of how far people can go. Normal people, everyday people. Only if you understand this, how humans can quickly cross the line into unacceptable behavior, then you have a chance to put the brakes on it and step back. Don't join the crowd. Don't throw one of the stones.
Man's life's a vapor full of woes. Man's life's a vapor full of woes.
I can remember growing up in the 50s And there was certainly hostility from the townspeople because we were different. And it's very hard to become accepted in a New England village in only one generation, and this was no exception. These people were only several generations removed from the folks in Salem who burnt witches.
Shirley had a very finely tuned sense of evil in the world and a very keen eye about other people and human nature. You can't read tarot cards without reading human nature. So I would say she must have felt that evil in the world comes out of people.
I think Shirley Jackson's art was to tickle that nerve, to remind you that at any moment the uncontrollable could start, whether it bubbles up from inside you or whether it falls on you from above, hardly matters. And the thinness of that ice, I think, was what made her writing good. Reminding you that, sure, the summer home is comfortable, but don't stay too long.
After her death, her agent sent us a letter she had received a few days after Shirley died, in which she said, "I'm going to be doing something very different soon, and I'll be in touch."